more of politics, and Mr. Bhutto faced the job of dragging Pakistan back onto its feet. But it all went wrong when the opposition accused him of rigging the March elections, which returned Mr. Bhutto with a huge majority. He has shown himself as an autocrat who often treats his political opponents with contempt. So, rather than accede to the opposition's demands, he locked all their leaders up in a government rest house. Mr. Bhutto has the reputation as Pakistan's most astute political figure, but it was a grave mistake. It was obvious Mr. Bhutto's political survival depended on some compromise. Reluctantly, he offered new elections, but he stalled on the details and the opposition made new demands. That was enough for the army. They were loyal to Mr. Bhutto throughout 4 months of rioting and martial law, when 350 people were killed. Ironically, it was Mr. Bhutto who originally persuaded the army to hand power back to the politicians. But today, the Army Chief of Staff said that he does not relish staying in power for long.
And here at home, the popularity, who was appointed Chief of Staff last year, said he'd taken over to end 4 months of political uncertainty after allegations of ballot rigging in the election last March. Most government and opposition leaders in Pakistan are under protective custody tonight, including the Prime Minister, Mr. Bhutto, who is believed to be still at his home in Rawalpindi or nearby. Mr. Bhutto has led Pakistan since the army dictatorship lost control of what is now Bangladesh in 1971, but his aristocratic methods haven't always found favour. Just before the last election, he was asked on BBC's Panorama if he considered himself arrogant.
I'm not arrogant. I would hate to be arrogant or to consider myself to be arrogant. But certainly I am intolerant of certain stupid things, certain absolutely naive things or absurd things, which people in politics or who think they are in politics try to propose on certain occasions or try to put forward. On those matters, if I have shown
Tonight, Pakistan's military ruler, General Zia. When he ousted Prime Minister Bhutto 4 months ago, General Zia at first promised, but then postponed elections. We report on the power of General Zia and the politics. It's been a very eventful year for Mr. Bhutto, the former Prime Minister. In March, he won a resounding election victory, so resounding that a large part of the electorate didn't actually believe it and took to the streets to say so. In July, the army politely removed him from office. This month, new elections were to be held, which might have swept him back to power. Instead, they've been postponed. Mr. Bhutto is now in jail on trial for ordering the murder of a political opponent and for corruption. As in India, which we'll be talking about later, the outcome of these turbulent events will determine what kind of democracy survives and whether politicians, once elected, can effectively be subject to the rule of law. That responsibility rests with General Zia, the mild-mannered ruler who ousted Bhutto. From Pakistan, Max Hastings reports.
On July the 5th, General Mohammed Zia Ul Haq led the military coup that deposed the Bhutto regime in Pakistan. He promised elections and a civilian government this month, and most people believed him. But now the polls have been postponed, Mr. Bhutto and his friends face trial, General Zia rules on. Is this simple or not so simple soldier the latest in the grisly line of Asian military dictators, or the crusader for justice in the wake of his nation's Watergate?
I wanted to achieve only one thing on 5th of July, and that was to revive the political government. That was my sole aim, which still is. But unfortunately, I could not achieve it in the 90 days that I had originally planned. Our aim is still the same, to bring in the civil political government as soon as possible, and that is the sole aim.
But even if Mr. Bhutto is convicted, under the circumstances in which he's been brought to trial, do you believe that it will in fact have any real effect on the level of his political support in the country?
I think very definitely. If in nothing else, at least for the first time in 30 years, we would have established that the politicians, like anybody else, have to answer for their deeds. And this is the first time in the history of Pakistan that we are taking a politician to establish his credibility or to vindicate his honors in the normal courts of law according to the law of the land.
Zia's archenemy, the man who made him Chief of Army Staff and whom he deposed in July, is Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan.
I'm not arrogant. I would hate to be arrogant or to consider myself to be arrogant. But certainly I am intolerant of certain stupid things, certain absolutely naive things or absurd things, which people in politics or who think they are in politics try to propose on certain occasions.
Mr. Bhutto is now occupying a single cell in the Kotlakput prison outside Lahore, facing trial on a host of charges from involvement in political murder to corruption. Every day he's brought under heavy guard to the sessions of Lahore High Court, and all Pakistan believes that General Zia and the army are determined to ensure his destruction before they give way to any new civilian government. Mr. Bhutto began to lose control of Pakistan early this spring. He just won an election by an overwhelming majority, but most of the nation was convinced that it had been fixed. The opposition began to demonstrate. Mr. Bhutto began to shoot. One March morning, here at Regal Crossroads in the midst of Lahore, the army opened fire, and in the months of ruthless government that followed, at least 460 people were killed in riots and demonstrations, and hundreds more were imprisoned without trial. By the end of June, even Mr. Bhutto's nerve was cracking, and he began negotiations with the opposition leaders for new elections and concessions, but he left it too late. The troops were sick of doing his dirty work at gunpoint, several senior officers had resigned, and they feared that worse was to come. On July the 5th, they deposed Mr. Bhutto and imposed martial law, and the politics of Pakistan have been in limbo ever since. How did you feel that night in July, having pledged your loyalty to Mr. Bhutto, having obeyed orders all your life? How did it feel?
Well, tell you frankly, it was hanging on the mind for a few days, and at that time I thought, whereas in the past I and my colleagues had tried our level best to lay one tradition, that the army should not get itself involved in politics, and we went out of our way, and in the process army and myself in particular, we earned a bad name also. So having gone to that extent, we were really hopeful that once, at least in Pakistan's history, we would enable or force the politicians to come to a political settlement. But not having achieved that, I was happy in one way, that at least I will now contribute myself in bringing a political settlement, and perhaps in 90 days will be able to reinstall a civil political government, which I thought would be an achievement by itself.
But that night, when you finally gave the order, did you feel nervous or happy or unhappy or...
No, I felt quite normal. To tell you frankly, I think some of my associates will be able to tell you. Honestly.
How did you feel when you were actually face-to-face with Mr. Bhutto, when the platoon who'd taken him prisoner brought him here to see you?
Quite normal. I shook hands with him, and I felt he was a little nervous, but I was quite normal.
But the Bhutto family are still fighting back with everything they can muster. The former Prime Minister's Iranian wife, Nusrat, and his daughter, Benazir, the last president of the Oxford Union, have flown into Lahore for the trials. They're conducting a frenzied campaign to defend Mr. Bhutto and bring down General Zia and the martial law government.
Why should I believe they will hold elections in March? Zia swore, he took the name of God. He said, I am a religious man, and as a religious man, I vow to the nation of Pakistan that I will hold elections on October 18. And he broke that promise. He vowed to the people of Pakistan that I will not arrest a single politician under martial law. Yet he has arrested the entire leadership of the Pakistan People's Party under martial law. He even arrested me under martial law, and I am not a former minister, I am not a former MNA. I was taking part in an election campaign, and he did not like the response of the crowds to me, and so he had to put down the tempo of the PPP, and he had to put me behind bars.
But however unlikely you may feel it to be, just supposing that he does have elections next spring, would you accept the verdict?
We are a party that believe in elections. Let me tell you, Zia promised in the United Nations, a world body, that elections will be held on October 18. 2 days later, he postponed them. Do you know how bad I felt? How sad I felt that he made a liar out of my nation in the eyes of the world? Lie in front of the people of Pakistan, that's a different matter. We'll take it at least. But did you have to make us liars?
But will you
We
accept...
want elections. I want immediate elections. What do you mean March? I want elections now. He promised elections now. Why hasn't he given the elections? I'll tell you why. Because the PPP would have emerged with as large a majority as it got in March. And if it had emerged with the majority it got in March, it would have made liars out of every single person that said there was rigging. That's why he had to postpone it.
Do you think
there was character assassination against us? There's been so much, and it is continuing. All these false cases in the courts, it's ridiculous. We are history's worst criminals.
I think that at the time you took over, your regime had much more goodwill than most military governments enjoy when they take over in any country. And yet, the two acts which have probably been most controversial since July, and the first was your postponement of the elections, and the second was your decision to try Mr. Bhutto. Do you think, in fact, that either of these two have been worth the damage that it's cost your credibility?
I think it's the other way around. No, honestly, I mean it. I think whereas we have been very benign and very kind, from comparatively speaking, from some of the military regimes that have gone past in this or in other countries, I think two constructive steps that I've taken, or we have taken, which have really established our credibility, is to try Mr. Bhutto, because accountability was one of our aims. And whereas initially we said we'll prepare the ground and we'll leave it to the next government, the mere fact that we have on ourselves taken this task of having the accountability of some of the policies taken itself has not only earned a good name for the regime, and I think it has also established a lot of confidence. Second thing by which I think the public opinion, by and large, which has received a sigh of relief, is by postponement of the election on the 1st of October. I think it's the other way around, rather than what you have put it up.
One of the key political rallying points of Lahore scarcely looks like a hive of activity. Yet while General Zia holds the ring, Pakistan's politicians are supposed to be gracefully preparing themselves to fight new elections. Mass rallies are forbidden, but here at the headquarters of the Pakistan National Alliance, the old conservative opposition to Mr. Bhutto, there's a constant succession of meetings and briefings. The PNA is a tenuous group, much weaker than Mr. Bhutto's party. Yet the army seem to hope that next spring or summer they can win an election and assume power. If the PNA succeed, Asghar Khan may well be their prime minister. Not surprisingly, since he's just been defeated in a Bhutto-organized election, he supported the army takeover in July.
There was no other way. It was just hopeless. He was distributing arms, weapons, licenses to people, and we felt he was going to have a large-scale massacre. And the army came in. There was no other alternative. He was not the legal prime minister either, because the election had been rigged. He had not been properly elected.
Many people say that whatever Mr. Bhutto's faults, he's still very much a modern man trying to drag Pakistan into the 20th century, whereas you yourself, although your honesty is beyond question, are very deeply associated with the Islamic revival and some very conservative forces. Do you think that you're capable of leading Pakistan at such a difficult time in its fortunes?
Unfortunately, the spirit of the crusade still lingers in Europe and in Britain. Islam is not a reactionary force. This is the fundamental error that you have. Islam is a faith for all time. We feel, we don't look backwards. We feel that if it's fit for today, it is fit for 50,000 years from today. And we think it's a dynamic, revolutionary force. Unfortunately, there's such a gulf, long history of misunderstanding that people think it's a reactionary people. It's not a reactionary people. We don't think ourselves reactionaries. So it's a modern, dynamic faith.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Inshallah Akbar. La ilaha illallah. Asghar Khan and the PNA believe, like General Zia, that religion is the base from which to build the new Pakistan. They want an appeal to Muslim loyalties that might also tap the vast reservoirs of Arab oil money in the hands of their Islamic brethren. Even Mr. Bhutto, a man fond of a drink himself, was driven to ban alcohol in his last months of power in deference to religious conservatives. The mullahs on their minarets have done nothing to erase the chronic poverty. The civilians of the cities have never fully forgiven the army for the 1971 defeat that lost East Pakistan forever. Many people here believe that Asghar Khan and General Zia misread the national mood, seek to appeal to traditions and forces that are already dying. After so many years of Ayub and Yahya Khan's military dictatorships in Pakistan, General Zia might seem merely the latest in a procession of ambitious autocrats. Yet in the months since he took over, he's convinced many Pakistanis that he's sincere in wanting a return to civilian rule. The question is whether this straightforward soldier with his blunt solutions has not already sunk himself into an impossible morass. At the Air Force Academy passing out parade, he's in his element. But among politicians, he seems to flounder. He's already damaged his credibility by abruptly postponing the promised elections. He's made Mr. Bhutto a martyr in the eyes of many of his people by imprisoning him.
Flight Cadet Tahir Ehsan Malik.
He has great personal charm, but a remarkable streak of naivety. Like so many military men before him, he seems to be falling into the trap of trying to revitalize his countrymen by teaching them to smarten up and march past in threes, to discipline them by methods that seem almost as harsh as those of which Mr. Bhutto's regime was accused.
They're whipping people up. They say it's Islamic. Well, let me tell you, Islam says whipping should be done for shame. But the way they whip people up, 2 boys in Liari were whipped to such an extent that for 3 days they were bleeding. Every time they went to the bathroom, all that would come out was blood. And when you whip, it's for shame, to show that, you're sorry you've done a deed. Not this barbaric skinning of the back, so that you're left in a mass of just raw meat. And what is their sin? That they ascribe to a particular political philosophy? That they said, long live Mr. Bhutto? It's a reign of terror, Mr. Hastings. That's it. I can't tell you how grim the situation is. One of our candidates is in jail. 10 whips and 1 year's imprisonment. Why? Because you gave a speech that was objectionable to martial law. I'm speaking to you now, and for what I say to you, I may be behind bars, because we're not allowed to say anything about that.
We have not put anybody in the jag on political grounds. But the persons who say that ours is as good or as bad a regime as the previous one, they should have to look inside. And if they compare, then they'll find out.
But the fact remains, General, that you have had some people put in prison and some people have been flogged. Is this in keeping with the kind of image you expected to establish when you took power?
We very much wanted to have our image established. As I said in the beginning, sometimes before, that military regimes, when they announce that they are for a limited time, which I announced I am here for 18th of October, nobody was going to give me any loyalty unless I demanded it by right. And by establishing some of these severe punishments, one of the basic aim was to establish authority and to make them feel that if they do something wrong, they will be punished, and they will be punished severely. That goes for the flogging. And also it's an Islamic punishment. I mean, it's not that somebody used the word barbaric. So I corrected him. I said, no, this has a religious bias also, because some of the punishments are Islamic, in which people get wrong ideas. By flogging, it is not meant to harm an individual bodily or physically. You know, Islam places more emphasis on the individual's self-respect. So if a man has done something wrong, and if he is made to realize in certain ways of his self-respect and how to maintain it, that is the punitive part, and not the physical or bodily injury by flogging him to an extent that you take his skin off.
Chandia is a tiny village in the Punjab, a few miles from Lahore. In one house, 55 people live in 3 rooms, subsisting on the wheat from 13 acres and the milk from a handful of cows and goats. Unlike India, nobody here starves, but it's the barest subsistence economy. One might expect people like these to welcome Islamic conservatism. Yet in reality, this is part of Mr. Bhutto's vast, loyal, rural constituency, unwavering in their support for him, whatever crimes he's accused of by city lawyers and outraged moralists. What do you think about Mr. Bhutto being in prison now?
ਹੁਣ ਮਿਸਟਰ ਭੱਟੋ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ 'ਚ ਹੈਗੇ ਹੁਣ ਕੀ ਖਿਆਲ ਹੈ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਹੁਣ ਅੱਧੇ ਤਾਂ ਦੇ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਚੰਗਾ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਕੌਮੀ ਧਾਤ ਵਾਲੇ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਆਦੇ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਅੰਦਰ ਹੀ ਰਵੇ ਤੇ ਦੂਜਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਅੱਧੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਆਦੇ ਨੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਆਵੇ
He says half the population wants him to stay there because they support the PNA, and the poorer lot, that is the people, they want him to come out because he serves the poor people.
You'll vote for Mr. Bhutto again if he comes out of prison? And what do you think of Mr. Bhutto?
He says that there'll be a lot of disturbances if elections are not held early, and disturbances should not take place.
But there are many allegations now that Mr. Bhutto has been corrupt, that he's been done unfair things to his opponents. What do you think about that?
He says, in my view, nothing of the sort took place.
And what happens if Mr. Bhutto is found guilty by the court and sent to prison for many years? What would you think then?
He says that Mr. Bhutto, well, he's already in jail. I mean, what they do to him is irrelevant because he has served the poor people and he's given them water and fertilizer and seeds, and he stands for the poor.
But the opposition are promising that if they take power, the PNA, that there will be a revival of Islam. Wouldn't this be popular?
He said, what the hell can Islam give us?
Even with its leader behind bars, Mr. Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party is still a formidable force under the chairmanship of his wife, still an immensely popular figure with party workers. The PPP believe that the votes of villages such as Chandia can win them an election that will enable them to free Mr. Bhutto. Their political machine can still tap a rich seam of optimism and exuberance. There's already... Their political machine can still tap a rich seam of optimism and exuberance. There's already talk of a PPP campaign of disruption and civil disobedience to break General Zia's regime. This desirable residence is the official home of Pakistan's prime ministers, and since July the 5th this year, it's been without a tenant. Elections probably will be held next spring because if they're not, the political tensions in this country could become intolerable. But some of the generals are already demanding that the army stays on because they fear that the only civilian capable of forming a government and ruling Pakistan effectively is still Mr. Bhutto. Beside his brand of cruel brilliance, Askar Khan and the PNA still look distinctly pedantic. In prison or out of it, innocent or guilty, Mr. Bhutto is still the most powerful single force in Pakistan's politics until the day his enemies can find the means to bury him. Obviously, it's very difficult for you exactly to interpret your father's feelings now, but if he were looking back over his 5 years in power, what do you think that he would look back on as his own mistakes?
Perhaps choosing General Zia as Chief of Staff.
And you're absolutely confident that, let's say, at the latest, within a year, you yourself will be back in private life, or as private life as any Chief of Army Staff can be?
I am looking forward to it, and I'm praying for it. And I'm confident. You know, last time somebody asked, I said, he said, what does it make you feel so confident that you'll be able to hold elections? I said, because I'm convinced. I'm not only convinced, I have the conviction. And I have the urge. And I know people of Pakistan are behind me. So I said, by Chingo, I will.
From a house in Islamabad, a motorbike starts its daily run, taking food to the death cell of Pakistan's former Prime Minister. Tonight, we report on the impending execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and we talk to General Zia Ul Haq, the President of Pakistan, and the man who will decide whether Bhutto lives or dies. But first, we've heard tonight of an amazing claim Bhutto are making one last attempt to save him from the gallows. They are trying to ask the Supreme Court to review its judgment last week rejecting Mr. Bhutto's appeal against the death sentence. Mr. Bhutto was convicted last year of organizing the death of a political opponent. If the lawyer's attempt fails, Mr. Bhutto's life will depend on the word of one man, General Zia Ul Haq, President of Pakistan. Only he could then save Mr. Bhutto by commuting his sentence to life imprisonment. General Zia has just given an interview to Tonight, which we'll see later. But first, David Lomax reports on the imminent execution of Mr. Bhutto, once a world politician remembered for his impassioned speeches, like this one to the United Nations at the time of the Bangladesh crisis in 1971.
I'm not a rat. I've never ratted in my life. I faced assassination attempts. I faced imprisonments. I've always been a man of crisis. Today I'm not ratting. But I'm leaving your Security Council. We will fight. We'll go back and fight. My country hearkens for me. Why should I waste my time here in the Security Council? I will not be a party to the ignominious surrender of part of my country. You can take your Security Council. Here you are. I'm going.
Pakistan has a population of more than 70 million people. There's widespread poverty, disease, illiteracy and unemployment, and the economy is virtually bankrupt. There's a military government, martial law and press censorship. The promised elections have yet to materialize. Most of the officials of the largest party are in detention, and the only alternative to a resumption of political life offered by the country's leaders is a move towards Islam. A new Islamic code of justice has been promised in Pakistan for many months. It sanctions prohibition and punishments like the amputation of thieves and regularizes the public beatings of wrongdoers, which have already taken place and met with the approval of the more conservative Muslims. So it's against this background that the Supreme Court of Pakistan at Rawalpindi and amid heavy security has been considering the most important case of political murder in their country's history. the appeal of the former Prime Minister, Mr. Bhutto, against the death sentence for organising the assassination of a political opponent. The court has ordered a 7-day stay of execution while their judgment is reviewed. The conditions in which Mr. Bhutto is being held have been the subject of much controversy here. The authorities claim that they're adequate and that the condemned man enjoys extra privileges. Mr. Bhutto's friends, however, claim that he's being treated little better than an animal. One of them has given us this sketch map of the condemned cell. It shows the room in which Mr. Bhutto is being held as being 10 feet by 7 feet, with a shelf, a table and a bed. It's next to 2 empty cells and opposite a bathroom with no running water. The condemned cell is inside the inner courtyard of Rawalpindi Jail and only a mile from the Supreme Court. Extra police have been billeted under canvas in the forecourt, and there are said to be anti-aircraft guns on the roof after an unlikely rumour that Mr. Bhutto's supporters were planning a James Bond-style escape for him by helicopter. Dr. Niazi, Mr. Bhutto's dentist, is the only medical man approved by the family who's been allowed to see the condemned man in the last 6 weeks.
His general health has been bad. He's lost a lot of weight, and he's what the doctors call it chronic gastritis. It needs further investigation to find out as to what is the cause that he was not able to eat. He's been throwing out food, and he's complained of consistent backaches.
Meanwhile, Mr. Bhutto's wife and daughter are both under house arrest in one of their family properties on the outskirts of the capital Islamabad, about 15 miles from the prison. They're forbidden from communicating with anyone, visitors are banned, and the telephone's been cut off. The guards, however, haven't been able to prevent them from posing for our cameras. We're from the BBC, from London, and we're just taking a picture of the house and the background. This court in our permission. We've also been able to film the daily motorbike run by one of the family's trusted servants, who takes specially prepared food to Mr. Bhutto in his condemned cell. It's felt, apparently, that this is a precaution against the authorities administering a slow poison to their former Prime Minister through the normal prison menu. What is this in the middle here?
Day and night.
Yes.
Day.
Day food and night food.
Yeah.
And what is in the middle here, please? Roti.
Naan.
That's sort of bread. Bread. Fine. Thank you very much indeed, please. Thank Just before Mrs. Bhutto's latest order for house arrest, we managed to get in touch with her, and she agreed to meet us at Dr. Niazi's house. 400 officials of her husband's party had just been arrested. The Supreme Court of Pakistan was about to pronounce on whether her husband should die, yet nothing seemed to affect her composure. Have you been followed here today?
I have been followed here today by 2 motorcyclists, 1 jeep and 1 Fiat car, full of people, full of their own hounds, bloodhounds I call them.
What was your husband's morale like when you saw him in prison?
He talks to us, he jokes with us. He also talks about when he's out, what we will do, what he shall do, what more reforms, what he shall do for the poor people of the country. He talks about the future always.
How have you been able to live with the strain of knowing that your husband has been sentenced to death and is now waiting for the judgment to appeal? How have you been able to live with that strain?
He's made a good name for himself in the world. They all accept that he's a great man. And if they hang him, he will go down in history also as a great man done injustice to him by a bunch of military men who were just hungry for power. And military coups d'etats never last long. We are a family of politicians. He goes, his son will come, his daughter will come, his grandson, his granddaughters, they will take over. We are not ashamed of him. He's done great things for this country. He's done great things for the people of the country. That is why 8 people have burnt themselves to death.
Most people in Pakistan are still prepared to accept that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is the only politician of any standing to have been produced in Pakistan's 30 years of turbulent history. Through his People's Party, he made genuine advances for the peasantry. After the disastrous loss of East Pakistan, he restored relations with Bangladesh and gave his fellow countrymen a new sense of national purpose. But Mr. Bhutto also made enemies. His extravagant personal lifestyle and arrogant manner were combined with a tendency to disregard and bypass democratic institutions.
I'm not arrogant. I would hate to be arrogant or to consider myself to be arrogant. But certainly I am intolerant of certain stupid things, certain absolutely naive things or absurd things which people in politics or who think they are in politics try to propose on certain occasions or try to put forward. On those matters, if I show a degree of intellectual contempt, that is not arrogance.
In July 1977, after riots and allegations of rigged elections, the military, for the 3rd time in Pakistan's history, seized power. General Zia Ul Haq, Pakistan's new leader, is a bluff, devout, professional soldier who, like many before him, declared that he'd only seized power as a last resort and that civilian rule would soon return. Many of General Zia's promises now seem to have an empty ring. Construction work continues for the institutions of a new democracy, but there have not been elections. He said he would never be president. He is. General Zia's regime has openly sided with the opposition to Mr. Bhutto, and even during the trial, conducted a ruthless propaganda campaign against everything the former Prime Minister's regime stood for. On page 49 of Volume 1 of the government's white paper on the performance of the Bhutto regime, it says Mr. Bhutto's ethics and the easy conscience with which he misused public resources were also reflected in the conduct of his colleagues. A complete record of their performance, it says here, cannot possibly be reproduced within the limited space of this document, and only a part of it is therefore being presented in the following pages. But then, of course, there's Volume 2, the treatment of fundamental state institutions, Volume 3, the misuse of the instruments of state power, Volume 4, the economy, and then a white paper on Mr. Bhutto's alleged misuse of the media, and finally another document of more than 1,000 pages of Mr. Bhutto's conduct of the general elections in March 1977. Many of these allegations are more than just petty charges about illegally imported luxuries. They concern cynical violations of human rights and are corroborated, according to one former colleague, by what Mr. Bhutto once said in an unguarded moment.
One of the nights when he had gone out for a cocktail party and came back and came up my steps, he had a bit too much. He was staggered up the steps, swaying from side to side, accompanied by the Commander-in-Chief of our Air Force, Air Marshal Rahim Khan. He came in and he started speaking about how he and I would rule this country before the elections. And when he went on, I said, look, I thought we were going to rule it through democracy. It was to be a democratic method and not rule through a thing. And he said, oh, forget about that. He said, that's for the birds.
Who said this to you?
Mr. Bhutto.
Mr. Bhutto actually said this to you?
Actually said this to me. He said, democracy is for the birds. He said, you and I are going to rule this country, wielding a stick over their heads. That's that is what these bloody bastards in Pakistan are fit for.
If Mr. Bhutto were to be hanged, what would that do to Pakistan?
Well, do nothing at all. In fact, I think it would be altogether good of Pakistan. People would know that nobody is above the law. Also, unfortunately, in Pakistan, so far, we've had very few dead heroes. we only have living heroes. When he dies, his Pakistan People's Party, I anticipate, will disintegrate, and that'll be the last of him. And I think it will have a very good, lasting effect on the politics of this country, that anyone who's in the chair is not above the law.
How do you react to those people who say that if your husband were acquitted and released, he would be a very vindictive man and would want vengeance for all that's happened to him?
This is a wrong analogy, which General Zia Ul Haq has been telling everyone, that he says it's either my neck or his neck. But in the sense that if he takes Mr. Bhutto's life, then his neck is involved. Then in Pakistan, in tribal areas, which also in Sindh, they say if justice is not done, then revenge has to take place. If they hang Mr. Bhutto unjustly, then I have told my sons, I don't only have 2 sons, which is Murtaza and Shahnawaz. I have got at least 2,000 sons in Pakistan. 2,000 sons who call me mother for a long time. And I have told them, if they are unjust to Mr. Bhutto, the chairman, your chairman, then you will have to take revenge.
Late today, Mrs. Bhutto and her daughter were moved to a rest house in a police training academy. There was no official reason for the move. The consequences, if Mr. Bhutto is executed, are the inescapable responsibility of one man, the President. Since the Supreme Court's rejection of Mr. Bhutto's appeal last week, General Zia has received pleas for clemency from nearly all the major leaders of the world. At the weekend, the President talked to David Lomax, who began by asking him why he'd placed Mr. Bhutto's wife and daughter under house arrest.
It's unfortunate that Bhutto family still believes not in the rule of law, but in rule of violence. And I'm trying to detain them for not indulging in such a luxury which we cannot afford at this time.
You're saying that Mrs. Bhutto believes in the rule of violence?
Violence, not rule of law. I wish she was.
But you're saying that Mrs. Bhutto believes in the rule of violence?
Miss Benazir Bhutto and the entire Bhutto family is for total violence in this country. That's why we have detained them.
Isn't it possible that people outside might see some of these actions as being an unfair action against the family?
I don't think so. For the peace and tranquility and for maintaining law and order, if I detain a few persons, I think there's neither anything immoral about this, nor anything wrong with this, because I think prevention is better than cure.
How much more difficult has it made your eventual decision that, as everybody knows, the judgment was a divided one? 4 of the judges recommending that Mr. Bhutto should hang, and 3 that he should be acquitted.
Yes, it doesn't make my task any difficult at all, because I think it is better in many ways, because it shows how independent the judiciary is. And in fact, we have a tremendous lot of regard and respect for our judiciary. And they have come out with flying colors as far as this case is concerned. The split verdict does not make my task or anybody's task any more difficult than a unanimous verdict would.
But it is an enormous split. 4 people, it's been pointed out there, from the Punjab who recommended that Mr. Bhutto should be hanged, and 3 judges from Sindh who recommended that Mr. Bhutto should be acquitted. That's a huge difference.
No, it's not so. I must say one thing more. It is very unfair and unethical, I think, to say that 4 judges from Punjab have convicted him and 3 non-Punjabis, although they're not all from Sindh, 3 non-Punjabis. It is like, pardon my saying, if somehow or the other myself or anybody from Pakistan would have commented on a court in the United Kingdom, and by saying that so-and-so judge was from Ireland, and so-and-so from Scotland, and so-and-so from Wales, and so-and-so from London, therefore the split was in that account. I'm sure nobody will buy that.
If Mr. Bhutto in the end were to be executed after the full process of law, what possible good could that do to Pakistan?
I would still not like to comment on this, all this very indirect manner. But all I will say is that good for Pakistan is what is good for law. And there's nobody above the law in this country, whether it's me or anybody else.
How do you react to all the international pleas for clemency?
I have felt nothing except I was telling a friend, I said, look, after some time if Zia Ul Haq is behind bars, I'm sure you'll have sympathized and send a message of sympathy. He said, sure. Mr. Bhutto has a long and fairly outstanding career in Pakistan. He is known to foreign heads of states. He has created friends. And irrespective of the legality of the case, all these friends are trying to do is to plead for clemency for him on humanitarian grounds. I would also take it as a trade union activity, because all the politicians are asking to save a politician. Not very many non-politicians have asked me for clemency. But I would say it has no effect. Because all these messages start off with, my dear so-and-so, and we want to emphasize that we are not interfering in your internal affair. This is your internal affair. There's a court of law. We have a tremendous respect for your judiciary. It is independent. Whatever the verdict of the case may be, we all accept it. But on humanitarian grounds, for the sake of this, spare his life. I mean, that's no argument.
You say you're absolutely unaffected by opinion in the rest of the world?
Well, so far, yes. If that can make any difference.
There's some people even say it's your neck or his.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I say. You know, people can leave anything they like. And arguments, you know, like this, Punjabi judges, non-Punjabi judges, army versus the politicians, Mr. Bhutto versus Zia Ul Haq, his neck or my neck, all these are arguments. But I can tell you honestly that we are so open-minded and we have led these events to take their own course according to the law. If I wanted, there was nobody to stop me on the 5th of July to kill as many people as I liked. In fact, it was one of our plans. In case of opposition, bump off. But somehow or the other, in Pakistan, we have the tradition of peaceful coup d'etats. Mine was also a peaceful. We shed no blood, we fired no bullet. We got hold of one man later on, and we are subjecting him to the rule of law. And whatever law will says, that will be done.
When are you going to have elections?
Well, we are committed on the point of elections. But we have also said that 1979 is the year of elections.
But you've been promising elections for a long time.
No. We promised elections after 90 days. Unfortunately, we couldn't hold it. Thereafter, I said I'm not going to give a definite date. Then I announced that the year of Lord 1979 will be the year of elections. And I also said that elections will be held by end of October 1979.
But what reason have people to believe you? Because elections have been talked about from the very beginning.
I do not demand any belief from them or not. Because I will do what is right and good for the country. I'm not going to be swayed or motivated by anybody who says this is good for Pakistan, this is not good for Pakistan. I, by the grace of God, have fairly good upper story. And I have some very wise advisors who are as good patriots as anybody else is.
Is it possible some people will construe that as being the word of a military dictator who has an unreal view of what is going on in this country?
Absolutely right, because power is...
Britain, France and many European countries have told Pakistan that they deeply regret the hanging of Dr. Bhutto, the former Pakistan Prime Minister. Dr. Bhutto was hanged this morning for plotting to kill a political opponent 5 years ago. 3 other men were hanged for carrying out his order. Dr. Bhutto's last words were, "Lord help me, I'm innocent." Number 10 Downing Street said Dr. Bhutto's hanging was a matter of Pakistan's internal law. The Prime Minister hanged for carrying out his order. Dr. Bhutto's last words were, "Lord help me, I'm innocent."
that the death penalty has been invoked. Mrs. Thatcher made no public statement, but sent a private message to Dr. Bhutto's family. President Carter has not said anything yet. 3 people were shot dead protesting at Dr. Bhutto's hanging in Kashmir. In Pakistan itself, demonstrators were out. They stoned a bus and a police station. The former Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, said she was shocked, and Pakistanis in Britain said they'd avenge him. This is how Pakistan Radio announced his death impersonally in English.
A press note issued by the Ministry of Interior in Islamabad today says following conviction by the Lahore High Court in the Nawab Muhammad Ahmad Khan murder case and subsequent rejection of his appeal by the Supreme Court, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged to death at 2 o'clock this morning in Rawalpindi District Jail.
Mr. Bhutto's immediate family couldn't be at the early morning funeral at his hometown in Sindh province. His wife and eldest daughter are under house arrest near Rawalpindi, where the execution took place, and his 2 sons live in London. Sarah Cullen saw the sons this morning and spoke to the elder of them.
Mr. Bhutto's sons spent last night checking reports of their father's death, but it was not until 3 hours after the first news that they heard the official statement.
Well, I don't want to say much. I came just to tell you that, of course, it's a personal tragedy, and they've tried to break our father. They've tortured him for 2 years. They couldn't do that. They tried to ruin his political name, and now they've killed him. We have nothing to be ashamed of. They have buried a martyr today. That's all I want to say. 4 o'clock in the morning.
How do you feel about not being at the funeral?
Terrible, naturally. Terrible, horrible.
There's been a great deal of international pressure on General Zia to reprieve your father. Were you surprised it went ahead?
They've shown they're capable of anything. The military has shown they're capable of doing anything. The way they treated Mr. Bhutto, we were shocked, but not surprised.
Have you spoken to your mother?
No, we haven't.
Did you ever hear officially from the Pakistan government?
The Pakistan government has announced it on the radio.
But did they let you know before?
No, they didn't.
What would you say was your father's achievement as a politician and a man?
He saved Pakistan from the ashes after the 1971 Bangladesh war. He gave our country freedom and a political awareness, and he gave our country democracy and social and economic justice.
What are you going to do now?
I have no idea.
What reaction would you expect in Pakistan now?
Honestly, don't know. I wouldn't like to comment on that. My mother and sister are there still, and we just do not know what the conditions are.
Friends and relatives arriving at the house could not conceal their emotion. They and the 2 young men spent the day in prayer. Now they plan to start a campaign to try and prove Mr. Bhutto's innocence. Sarah Cullen, News at 10, West London.
All day, statements have been issued by governments who'd asked the Pakistan government for clemency. Government's view from the Foreign Secretary, and the Pakistan government's from one of their cabinet ministers.
The issue is, of course, for the jurisdiction of Pakistan, but we had hoped that they would exercise clemency in the peculiar situation and the circumstances surrounding this whole issue.
They are arguing, in fact, that the issue is a purely criminal matter, that it is not a political one, and that nobody is above the law.
Yes, and that is their right to argue that, but it's equally well the right of our government and many other governments, Muslim governments, governments all around the world, to ask for clemency. There are peculiar circumstances. We know that this will be very divisive within the Pakistani communities in our own country and also, I suspect, within Pakistan itself.
Mr. Bhutto was always a controversial character. His progress was meteoric, a shooting star who finally crashed to earth. What he undoubtedly possessed was charisma, but he also made many enemies, and in the end, the brilliant career ended in disaster. Bhutto was born into the purple, the son of a rich landowner in the Sindh who became a man of the people. He went to Oxford and was called to the bar, and all his life remained something of a split personality, a Western intellectual and an Eastern potentate. He became foreign minister in 1963 and showed the Third World that he knew how to stand up to the West. He was at his most forceful and typical in 1971 when he spoke about the war with India, which tore Pakistan apart.
My country hearkens for me. Why should I waste my time here in the Security Council? I will not be a party to the ignominious surrender of part of my country. You can take your security council. Here you are. I'm going.
The war led to the creation of an independent Bangladesh and heavy losses to the Pakistani army in men and morale. At home, the government collapsed and Bhutto was recalled. He flew back to Islamabad, the capital, the only man, it seemed, who could save the country. And he went to work with a will, salvaging what he could of the chaos of the war, negotiating the release of 90,000 Pakistani POWs, nationalizing sectors of the economy. But increasingly, his critics say, he saw himself as the only man who could run Pakistan, and his methods became increasingly autocratic. He treated his cabinet like dirt, according to officials. One minister was beaten up for walking out on a dinner party, and political opponents were thrown into jail or simply disappeared. In January 1977, he stood for re-election as Prime Minister and won a resounding victory, so resounding that he was accused of rigging the poll. Demonstrators throughout the country began calling for Mr. Bhutto's resignation. The situation was soon out of control, the army was called in and the shooting started. When 300 people had been shot dead, the army moved in, deposing Mr. Bhutto and his government in a bloodless coup. General Zia had taken over. But long before this, in 1974, this man's father was killed in an ambush at a roundabout in Lahore. The man, Ahmed Raza Kazuri, a former MP, claimed that Bhutto had given the assassination orders. How did he know?
Eventually I was convinced that the man who is planning all these attacks from remote control and who is operating in a closed-circuit conspiracy is somebody where the long arm of the law cannot reach. And eventually I was convinced that it is Mr. Bhutto.
While Bhutto was in power, the case was shelved, but after the military takeover, the state moved in and Bhutto was charged with conspiracy to murder. The trial started in Lahore in September 1977, and in the following March he was found guilty. He appealed, and in May, Bhutto was moved to this jail in Rawalpindi, only a few hundred yards from the house he occupied as Prime Minister. The appeal was finally turned down on February the 6th, and despite last-minute efforts by his lawyers, General Zia refused to grant clemency.
Justice must be done, and nobody is above the law according to my conviction. It's unfortunate that the person who is involved in this case, who has been convicted, the former Prime Minister, happened to be a politician. He happened to be the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. He happened to be the chairman of the People's Party. But that does not make him or anybody else above the law.
Mr. Bhutto was hanged this morning at 2 a.m. in the dark with the 3 other accused. Their names will not be remembered.
So today, before dawn, General Zia sent Mr. Bhutto to the gallows. He was buried only hours later, hundreds of miles away, in the family grave. His supporters soon reacted, as Mark Tully reports from Rawalpindi.
At first, Mr. Bhutto's supporters in Rawalpindi were stunned by the news. But by midday, they'd started to gather in Liaquat Park, the park where Mr. Bhutto launched his own movement against Ayub Khan. Some were chanting prayers, and some were shouting slogans against the military ruler who ousted Mr. Bhutto and gave the final orders for his execution. When the crowd swelled to some 2,000, the police dispersed them with a baton charge. As they fled, they stoned cars and beat up an army officer. There was some trouble in Lahore when police had to disperse young men smashing up cars in protest against the hanging. And there's also very tight security in the whole area surrounding the village where Mr. Bhutto was buried.
Mr. Sarfraz, are you quite sure your government was right to execute Mr. Bhutto in the face of near unanimous condemnation from international opinion?
Frankly speaking, the appeals made for clemency in case of Mr. Bhutto, I think generally they were on the supposition that Mr. Bhutto was receiving a political trial. Whereas the fact of the case is it was not a political trial, it was not a summary trial or military trial. It was an ordinary criminal case registered against him during his own prime ministership. The case was pending trial and the courts went through with the trial.
But
civil courts.
Deny reports which have been widespread in our newspapers that the ordinary people of Pakistan would have preferred General Zia to show clemency towards Mr. Bhutto.
I don't agree with you here. But yet, I don't feel very happy on the execution of Mr. Bhutto. Nobody will feel happy. Even President Zia Ul Haq is not happy on execution.
Well, there was justification for his execution, Mr. Sarfraz. Was there also justification for the squalid and degrading conditions in which, according to most newspapers we've been reading here, he was kept for almost the last year of his imprisonment?
I assure you that he was kept for the last, even till the last day, he was kept in a very, very decent manner in the jail.
So all the newspapers that we read here, which said that he was denied proper medicines, a proper lavatory even, all these are lies.
Yes, I agree. I would say that, not lies, I would put it this way, that people have been sort of, putting it this way, insinuating as if Mr. Bhutto has been receiving inhuman treatment, whereas normally on the type of charges he was being tried, the other people in the jail, if you have a look at that condition, he was having a far better treatment. He was almost given proper respect till the last minute.
Why was he hanged so furtively, as it seems, in the middle of the night, and then buried within hours with neither his wife nor his daughter present at the graveside?
About 200 people, roughly, every year in Pakistan are hanged with murder charges. In every case, the sentence is executed in the darkness of the night, early hours of the morning, and in every case, the person executed, his body is delivered immediately at the place of his residence.
But is General Zia's government right to be confident of the future? Pakistan, with its tribally based society, has never proved easy to govern, and the political loyalties in its 4 provinces could dictate the future. The party which Mr. Bhutto formed in 1967, the Pakistan People's Party, has its main support in the Punjab and the province of Sindh, where the Bhuttos are one of the main traditional families. In a last testament written in his cell, Mr. Bhutto himself warned, "If I am assassinated on the gallows, there will be turmoil and turbulence, conflict and conflagration." Most of his party's leaders are now in prison or under house arrest, including his widow, the Begum Nusrat Bhutto. But she too has warned that following his execution, revenge is inevitable.
If they hang Mr. Bhutto unjustly, then I have told my sons, I don't only have 2 sons, which is Murtaza and Shahnawaz. I have got at least 2,000 sons in Pakistan. 2,000 sons who call me mother for a long time. And I have told them, if they are unjust to Mr. Bhutto, the chairman, your chairman, then you will have to take revenge.
And with us now is Dr. David Taylor of the School of Oriental and African Studies. How potent a factor do you think revenge is now going to be in Pakistan's politics?
I think Mrs. Bhutto is perhaps exaggerating a little bit, but revenge will always be in the mind of the Bhutto family and of very many of the people of Pakistan who look to Mr. Bhutto for leadership. And if and when the Pakistan People's Party comes back to power, they will want to curb the power of the army and of the generals.
What do you think are General Zia's intentions? I mean, is he